Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, they say doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is a sign of insanity. So why has the conversation about how to reduce inflation remained so limited to the interest rate hikes Biden has been implementing since March, despite not getting significant results? The Fed has hiked interest rates 5 times in 2022, and these hikes have come with warnings from Federal Reserve Board Chair Jerome Powell that they will, quote, bring some pain to households and businesses. That's hardly an admission the Biden administration should be welcoming in the middle of a tough midterm season. So why are elite economists like Powell and Clinton favorite Larry Summers singularly focused on higher interest rates and higher unemployment as solutions to rising inflation, ignoring alternatives that would hurt the people less? Is it because they would hurt their Wall Street friends more? This is how folks are responding to high inflation in France. Thousands of working people are in the streets demanding higher wages and protesting rising living costs, threatening to withhold their labor in a general strike if corporations don't share their record profits with the people that really worked to achieve those profits. Meanwhile, here in America, JP Morgan CEO and bailout recipient Jamie Dimon is saying the quiet part out loud.
I don't look at a recession as a bad thing.
Even a recession could be good for JP Morgan's share price. Here is their chairman and CEO, Jamie Dimon.
I mean, it's bad for America. It's bad for the people unemployed. It's usually an opportunity for JP Morgan.
Straight from the horse's mouth, recessions are good for Wall Street. And he's not the only one. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers was ratioed on Twitter for blaming inflation on workers earning too much money. Are you earning too much money? Are your pockets bursting at the seams? Are you finding it easier to pay for your kids' education or your hospital bills or your rent? Have you maybe noticed that the minimum wage hasn't gone up since 2009, even though the cost of everything else has? If you feel like real wages have not budged in decades, you're right, they haven't. So why are leading neoliberal economists saying that the real problem here is that workers aren't working enough and that wages are just too high? Look, here's something conservatives and leftists can agree on. Raising interest rates isn't working. That's the subheadline from a recent Guardian report that examines why prices have been persistently high even as the Federal Reserve continues to raise interest rates. The Fed's overly aggressive actions are shoving our economy to the brink of a devastating recession, economist Rikin Mahmood told the Guardian. And the reason is obvious to anyone who cares to look at the roots of what is in reality a global crisis, not just an American one. Supply chain bottlenecks, a volatile global energy market, and rampant corporate profiteering cannot be solved by additional rate hikes. I mean, obviously, look, the reason the political discourse has been focused on interest rate hikes is because it's basically the only tool at the disposal of the Federal Reserve. But it is not the only tool at the disposal of the Biden administration, which has a mixed record on using maximum political pressure to address the high prices millions of Americans are seeing, not just at the gas pump, but in grocery stores, on their rent checks, and their hospital bills. For example, Biden will announce today that he's releasing 15 million barrels of oil from the nation's energy reserves. But that's just simply a continuation of his plan announced back in March to release 180 million total barrels from our reserves. The price of oil did come down since the summer, but September saw rising prices, and Biden is now facing the consequences of OPEC's decision to cut oil production by 2 million barrels a day. If only there were some other factor at play here that Biden could influence to bring down prices. Perhaps a significant geopolitical entanglement that caused crude oil prices to skyrocket from $76 per barrel at the start of January 2022 to $110 per barrel on March 4th, 2022. What happened between January and March of this year? I'm sure if I just think hard enough, oh yeah, the war in Ukraine. But the Biden administration has been clear. It's more important to weaken Russia at any cost than to keep costs down or even win midterms, perhaps. Not to mention that with defense stocks way up, who would want to mess with the profits being earned by Lockheed Martin and the like? After all, 20 members of Congress personally invest in weapons contractors that will profit from the Ukraine aid packages. The Biden administration gets closer to the root of the inflation crisis as it attempts to address food prices. Earlier this year, Biden pledged to invest $1 billion to support independent meat processors, the idea being that it would boost competition and bring down prices. Moreover, the DOJ is investigating price fixing in the meat packing industry. But that's just the tip of the price gouging iceberg. Over half of the increase in prices that have occurred during the COVID era are attributable to fatter profit margins, according to the author of a new report from the Economic Policy Institute. Quote, companies are taking higher inputs, putting a bigger markup on them than they were previously, and then passing that on to consumers. That's you. An analysis of 100 top corporations' SEC filings showed that 80 of those 100 companies had increased net profits since 2019, even as inflation flattened workers' wage gains. Think about that. Even as companies claim they couldn't do anything about high demand and the cost that came with the supply chain crisis, they were seeing record profits and passing more costs off to you because they could. Not only is there nearly no mainstream discourse about this problem in this country, Americans seem largely unaware of the fact that things could be run differently. Although there are no specific laws prohibiting price gouging in the EU, for instance, they do have laws that prevent so-called dominant businesses from directly or indirectly imposing unfair purchase or selling prices or other unfair trading conditions. France has lower inflation rates than we do, better consumer protections, and they're still fighting in the streets for more. Meanwhile, in the US, two of the largest supermarket chains, Albertsons and Kroger's, are planning to merge, setting the stage for even less competition and even higher food costs. As journalist Mo Tachik explained earlier this week, you can see that grocery stores are especially anti-competitive by comparing price increases in grocery stores at 13% to inflation in restaurants, which is only about 4.5%. The reason, she explains, is that grocery stores are much more anti-competitive compared to the dog-eat-dog restaurant industry. Because they can, Kroger has committed $4 billion to stock buybacks since COVID started. Instead of investing in its businesses, it has chosen to drive up its own stock price, all while closing supermarkets to avoid paying the $4 to $5 an hour hero pay bonus implemented early in the pandemic. Albertsons, controlled by private equity firms, has basically been run into the ground and squeezed for corporate profit with no concern for what happens to the business or the people who work there or shop there. Post-merger, Kroger stands to corner a full 16% of the U.S. grocery market. The industry may be closer to an oligopoly than we think, a Morgan Stanley analyst acknowledged. Here's to fancy ice cream getting so expensive that even Nancy Pelosi might think twice before stocking her freezer with a $14 a pint Haagen-Dazs. Now, there is some good news. There has been opposition to the merger from left voices like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and a hearing will be held next month to evaluate the anti-competitive, inflation-raising implications of this merger. And on the oil price front, Representative Katie Porter of California has introduced and passed a bill in the House that would make it illegal for oil companies to gouge people during emergencies, a bill that, regrettably, no Republicans voted for. But this is the problem. Despite some common sense solutions existing in the policy sphere to tackle inflation, the discourse at present is mostly Democrats parroting the Fed's line about raising interest rates and defending Biden, while Republicans play the blame game without proposing any policies that could actually put more money in the pockets of working Americans. Turn on mainstream news and you'll hear little to nothing about the Russia-Ukraine war, price gouging, or lax antitrust protections as drivers of inflation. And so there's little appetite for solutions. Keeping the public ignorant of how our economic reality could improve while focusing on, say, the culture wars works. Luckily, we here have the power to start to shift that conversation. So I was pleasantly surprised. I was reading this New York Guardian article that came out a few days ago about this new economic policy report about the drivers of inflation and what could be done. And it's both kind of disappointing insofar as we haven't pursued it, and so many of these ideas seem novel to the ear, even for a big news consumer like myself, but also optimistic, because I do think there's a kind of paralysis that can set in when you are just so used to hearing month after month after month, I guess we got to do another interest hike. And then you hear all the negative consequences of that, and it's hard to see how to get out of that sort of a spiral.
Well, yeah, it sounds like this is an area where you and I can find some common agreement, because people of my ideological bent are inclined to say that also government spending has a bad impact on inflation, and there are some things we should cut. But you were agreeing that there were, for instance, the Ukraine effort, our defense budget, there are areas where we can agree on reducing the government's activity, and I think that would be a marvelous way to combat our spiraling out of control inflation. And obviously this is debated among economists, but there are some studies that have found runaway government spending that will cause inflation to get worse, even, and will counteract whatever they're doing with the interest rate hikes.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the issue. When I was looking at the kind of messaging that you're seeing from conservatives, I was looking at some things that Ron DeSantis had said. Everyone's pointing to the idea that the COVID relief packages fueled this crisis that we're in right now, without really owning up to the fact that those packages were necessary to keep the economy going, and that they were enormously popular at the time. They were necessary to get, vaccines
but those things could both be true.
And all of the right.
Sure.
So here's the question. The question now is, who's going to feel the pain of getting everything back in line? And is there a reason that the policies that are being pursued are those that are going to disproportionately affect working people, as opposed to curbing the kind of spending, let's say Ukraine war spending, that
millions
is benefiting
and millions
Lockheed Martin
week.
and Raytheon and all of these kinds of people. Moreover, even if you believe that, say, the COVID packages were a bad idea, it's a done deal. So what is your plan now, Republicans? In good faith, I'm asking this question, for getting things back on track without completely abandoning working and poor people. And when I looked at what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, he has been very critical of the COVID relief packages as drivers of inflation, at the same time that he's using federal funds dispersed through those packages to give these, I think, $450 per child distributions to families in Florida, which I think is a good thing. But it is that very money that he is criticizing for having driven inflation. So there's this tension here.
I understand that tension, but I do think and I believe Kevin McCarthy said it, if Republicans take control of the House, there's far more likely to be a halt to the spending on the Ukrainian war effort under, under Republican leadership than under Democratic leadership at this point.
I think it's more likely, but given that still a small fraction of Republicans, only 11 of the 50 senators, and only, I think it was like the high 50s in the House of the 200.
Well, we'll see. It's going to be a slightly different. It's going to be a slightly different House. It's going to be a House more characterized by those kinds of Republican voices who are very stridently anti-war. They're a minority right now, but they're a growing one.
Yeah. Well, it will be interesting to watch. Either way it goes. We'll have more Rising for you coming up next.